So let's get rid of these nodes and let's start with a simple line. So drop down a line, and to determine how big this line should be, let's turn on show all objects so we can see our ground. Let's go inside our camera and let's go maybe to frame 100 where the camera is already zoomed out. And let's maybe increase the length here, so we just want to make sure that this line reaches all the way to the top, so outside of our camera region. So let's set this to maybe a length of 15. And now I can hide other objects and let's work on our line. Let's go back to the first frame and let's do the thing that we mentioned with the point. So let's add a point and let's just copy this line to points and use this as a target. So now we should have just our line in the center of the scene. Let's create that amp attribute that will drive the animation. So let's drop down an attribute wrangle. Let's rename this to set amp, and I will say that at amp equals at frame -1. And below it, let's refit this. So at amp equals fit amp from 0 to a max channel, and then from 0 to 1. And all of this should be placed inside a ramp. So ch ramp, let's just rename this to ramp, and let's create all of these channels. Let's maybe start with a max of 25 and let's recreate that ramp earlier with this sharp turn here. So make all of these handles B-spline and maybe drag this up a little bit. So let's preview the result and let's maybe just drop down a null here, and this will be my main LTG. So all of the lighting elements will have this LTG abbreviation. So before this I will drop down a resample node. Let's maybe preview this and see how many points we have. So let's maybe increase the resolution. Let's set the length maybe to 0.02. And the first thing that I want to do here is add some noise. So drop down an attribute VOP and I will rename this to add noise. Step inside and let's generate an AA flow noise. Set this to a 3D noise and add this to our P. Alright, and plug this into the P. So here I want to promote frequency, offset, amplitude and roughness. And I want this amplitude to be scaled by our amp attribute. So double click this handle and let's import our amp. So bind, set this to amp, and I will just multiply this amp parameter. So this is the amplitude of the noise. So if I go up, let's press play, and we can see that this gets all noised up over a period of 25 frames, and it starts fast and slows down and settles over time. And in here I can also increase the amplitude, and we can see that I can't increase the amplitude from this parameter, and this is because it has the same name as our amp attribute. So maybe I will just click on this parameter and I will set this to be amp1. So now if I go up, I should be able to increase the amplitude. So maybe I will just increase this to a value of 1.5 and the animations should still come through. So this is perfect. Let's also link our amp attribute with the offset Y, and we can see that if I make this go in the negative direction, that we have this lightning sort of go through the ground. So let's set this back to 0. Let's go inside the attribute VOP and let's make some room here. Let's double click the offset, and from here I want to add from this offset. So let's drop down an add node and let's duplicate this amp attribute, place this here. Let's place this inside a float to vector, so turn this into a vector. So we want the Y value to be affected, and drag this wire over here. And I can place this into my second input for the offset, and if I play the animation, we can see that we have this subtle animation of the lightning going up. So we want to reverse this direction, and maybe actually I will just drop down here a multiply and promote the second parameter here. And let's rename this parameter to offset multiplier. And if I go up, we can set this to a negative value to go into the ground, and we can maybe also increase this value by 5. So let's just set this to -5 and see what we get. So if I play this, maybe this is a little bit too much. Let's maybe go with -2.5. And this is pretty good. I also maybe don't want this offset animation to completely stop towards the end, and what we can do is we can go back inside, and I will copy this geometry VOP, and I want to access the time from this. So maybe we can add to this vector that we created with the amp. So maybe drop down and add here, and if I place the time in the second input here, we will have a continuous animation now with the offset. Maybe let's just scale this, so I'll drop down a multiply constant, and let's scale this with a value of 0.33 maybe. So let's just maybe play a little bit, so we can see that we have this continuous animation, which is basically added on top of our animation with the amp attribute. So this feels a little bit more natural to me. Let's go up, and maybe I will decrease the roughness overall, and maybe set the amplitude to 1.4. So just decrease this a little bit. So this is looking good so far. I also want to scale the amplitude towards the end here. So I want this point of contact here at the center of the scene to be pretty much intact. So from my resample node, I will generate a curve view attribute, which we can use inside our attribute VOP. So let's go to our amplitude here, and let's actually just duplicate this one and bring my curve view attribute, and this I want to plug inside a ramp parameter, and let's set this to a spline. Let's give this a label, so this can be ramp curve view, and place this into this multiply here. And if I go up, let's reset the ramp, and let's make some modifications here. So I only want to really single out this part over here towards the end. So grab all of these and turn these into B-spline, and maybe just adjust this curve a little bit. So now this point here towards the center will remain static. Let's maybe increase the frequency a bit overall, and maybe increase the amplitude. Let's maybe set this back to 1.5. Let's now create a p-scale attribute to give this line some thickness and geometry. So drop down another attribute VOP, which I will rename to set p-scale. And again, I will want to import our amp attribute. So bind and set this to amp. And let's just directly export this to the, let's bind export and set this to be our p-scale. And let's also maybe just drop down a multiplied node and create a global multiplier for this. So promote my second input, and let's reset this to this label to p-scale. Let's just call it p-scale amplitude. So let's go up and let's set this to 1, or actually maybe 0.1. And let's take a look inside a polywire how this p-scale will look. So drop down a polywire, and over here for the wire radius, set this to p-scale. So if I preview this, this is the thickness currently. So we can see that this is mapped to our amp attribute. So it starts from 0 and rapidly increases to a value of 1. There's some jittering happening here, and this is because we have to turn this option for prevent joint buckling, and maybe increase the divisions to 6. And from here also let's maybe drop down a normal and recalculate the normals. Let's maybe go to the p-scale and let's set this to a smaller value, so 0.5 or maybe 0.35. So I want the p-scale to fade in from a value of 0 and fade in rapidly with the bind attribute. Let's maybe set this back to 0.5, and these values are subject to change, so maybe we will change this later when we preview it with our geometry. So this p-scale is going from a value of 0 to 1, and what we can do here is let's also create a ramp parameter for our amp, and let's set this to spline, and let's go up and reset the ramp. So what I can do is also fade this towards the end, and this will fade it back to a value of 0. Alright, so it starts, and maybe I can adjust this ramp a little bit so it remains to a value of 1 a little bit longer. Alright, so now it completely fades towards the end here. And we can always just go back up, and maybe I want to increase the duration of this whole animation. So this is the whole purpose of why we did this copy to points trick, is we can now influence the whole entire animation with a few values here. So maybe let's set this to be a duration of 40. Okay, so now the lightning pretty much lingers a little bit longer. And let's maybe set this to 45 even. So this is looking pretty good, and maybe I can even influence the P scale along the curve. So in this P scale attribute VOP, let's drop down a curve view attribute. So bind import the curve view and place this inside a ramp. And let's rename this. Let's give this another name. So ramp 1, and rename this to curve view ramp. Set this to be a spline, and plug this in our multiply. So let's go up, reset the curve, and also adjust some of these handles a little bit. And maybe just let's bring this all the way down and just taper it maybe towards the beginning here. And maybe set the overall P scale to maybe 4. We'll have to adjust this value with the geometry, and maybe bring this over even more.